Everyone say hi recording. We are recording. You're super quiet. I feel like I'm talking to myself. But that's fine. I see your faces. I see you're listening. It's okay. Now, last class on Friday, we were talking about the independence of Mexico and its relevance for Mexican state building and for modern day Mexico, right? And what issues did we bring up? What were the topics of the discussion?
There's no specific day when we can say Mexico was invented.
Okay, so we saw that the independence of Mexico is, I mean, you mean the creation of Mexico? There's no specific date, right? There's a bunch of that could compete for the role, right? What else? When we read the Declaration of Independence of Mexico, what type of ideas did we find?
More conservative ones.
Conservative ideas, like what?
Like give the God credit for
So a
rights.
focus on religion. What else?
Continue having the monarchy.
So it talks about a monarchy. Now the thing is, was this a liberal monarchy or a conservative monarchy? Because the issue is, we're actually going to talk about this today and maybe again on Wednesday. When we learn about another stage in Mexican history, which is the War of Reform, Las Guerras de Reforma, we are generally led to believe that this was a conflict between conservatives and liberals, where the conservatives were represented by Maximiliano de Habsburgo and the liberals were represented by Benito Juarez, correct? However, when we actually make a diagnosis of their ideas, the thing is, Maximiliano was pretty much a liberal monarch. The Second Mexican Empire was a liberal monarchy. They had representative bodies. They had a constitution. There were rights being recognized for Mexicans. There was equality, right? Because while there was a monarchy, there wasn't really a nobility, really, right? And similarly, Benito Juarez defended liberal ideas that were very much matching the ones of Maximiliano, which is why it was kind of a difficult rivalry, because they kind of agreed with each other in a bunch of things, right? Now, another thing they had in common is the way they governed. So while Maximiliano did imperial decrees, Benito Juarez governed by presidential decrees, right? So because liberalism makes agreeing on things difficult, decrees were what was happening on both governments, which is kind of the reason some people say that if Benito Juarez had been alive longer, he would have been a full-blown dictator, because he honestly did not enjoy going through the trouble of convincing Congress to do things. He just ordered them himself. So if we know it was not an ideological conflict, it's not that they disagreed on ideas. We know it was not about the way they governed, because they were both kind of doing the same things, although from different types of chairs, either the emperor or the president's chair. What was the fight between those two actually about?
Religion?
Religion? No, they were. Why?
Because Benito wanted to separate the church from the state.
Maximiliano too.
Really?
Yep.
The power?
I'd say yes. It was pretty much about who was in charge.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the issue is, we talked about the independence of Mexico and we saw that it's mostly conservative. We also talked about Mexico nowadays, and we figured out that it has many liberal aspects, our society right now. Right? These liberal aspects came up during the War of Reform, which is when Mexico had its first liberal constitution, the Constitution of 1857. And what we're going to try to look at right now is how this shift in ideas happened. However, we are not going to look at lists of events or lists of documents, because although that is kind of the way that we learn these topics in primaria and secundaria, where we're like, la batalla de no sé qué, el plan de no sé qué, blah, blah. or we focus on individuals and we're like Benito Juárez, Maximiliano de Habsburgo, Felix Maria Calleja, etc. We can't, that's not very productive for this class in particular, because what we are trying to learn is how to apply concepts. So while I may not need you to know things like en qué año se publicó el plan de Ayutla, kind of irrelevant, you can find that on Wikipedia whenever you want, I do need you to be able to look at a document and diagnose whether if it's liberal, conservative, or both. Yeah? So let's do, well, first of all, let's do a quick review. Tell me. Liberalism. What types of ideas are liberal?
Individual perspective.
Very good. So in liberalism, we have a focus on individuals doing things that does not exist in conservatism. What?
Human rights?
Not really. That's invented in like the 1940s or 50s. Here we're in 19th century liberalism.
Liberty?
Well, actually, now that you mention it, we do have the idea of rights. Not specifically human rights. Human rights are something that came up a lot later, about 100 years later. But we do have the notion of rights, that people have certain things that are right in the sense of correctas. Right? Another thing, you mentioned liberty. What did you say, Santiago?
Liberty.
Kind of. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here we have freedom. Another thing is, do we have a
Auto-government.
equality? Very good.
Or self-government.
Self-government. I mean, not specifically. That comes a little later.
Okay.
At this point, it's about following ideals that justify things morally, right? And these moral justifications come from the ideas of freedom, equality, and rights. So you can't have a type of government that violates equality, freedom, and rights. Yeah?
Okay.
But the notion that this type of government needs to be a self-government, it comes a little later. Now, anything else?
Express our ideas.
So the individual perspective, right? Now, another thing that comes up here is think of the way the United States created itself. In the Declaration of Rights, in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, is it all like in the Declaration of Independence of Mexico, where it's like, La Nación Mexicana, ahora es independiente? In the United States, is it like, the United States, this one thing, it is now independent? Or is it individual states deciding to come up with a better system where each one of them decides and we'll see who joins, etc.? Particularly considering that, is the United States right now the same shape that it was when it became independent? Not at all, right? It was a long process where each state had to decide to go to the Continental Congress, decide to ratify the Constitution, etc. Right? So here we have the idea of union, where it's the idea that countries are united, but because they decide to be united for moral reasons, right? It's communities that decide to build something together because it's the right thing to do. Yeah? Now, when we talk about conservatism, what types of ideas do we find?
Divine rights?
Well, I mean, not specifically divine rights maybe, but a focus on tradition, which in Western or European context allows itself to be identified with religion, right? So conservatism focusing on tradition is not this irrational thing that we see from a liberal perspective, right? For liberals, for people to be like, we don't care about justifying things. We follow tradition, it's irrational. But from a conservative perspective, tradition exists for a reason, right? If it's been done for centuries, it's because it works. And doing away with it just because is, on one hand, irrational, right? You're actively deciding to not do something that works, but also kind of presumptuous, presumido, right? It's this idea that says, estos millennials que tienen 15 años pero creen que saben cómo funciona el mundo, pues no, ¿eh? O sea, ¿qué les pasa? Right? And nowadays we see it like that. Back in the 19th century, there was this philosopher called Edmund Burke, who was very much pro-freedom, pro-equality, etc. But he was also very much against the French Revolution because he was like, you know, the French monarchy exists for a reason. It's worked for centuries. That's why it's there. And all these youngsters being like, oh no, we're actually going to kill everyone just because we feel like it. That's both really violent, really immoral, and really presumptuous. Why do they think they know better? Right? So what else besides tradition? Do we have freedom and equality?
No.
No.
What do we have?
Inequality.
What else do we call that?
Rigid social structure.
Yes, we have a rigid social structure, which means there is inequality, right? There is, the system itself tells us people are not equal, right? Some people are more important than others. That's how it is. And this social status, what does it tell us? Do people need freedom in this type of system? No? What do they have? How do they know what to do with when they wake up? Anyone? Silent, just silence. This is first partial stuff, literally like first week of class stuff. Well, no, like second week. But still, in a conservative system, how do people know what they have to do with their lives?
Because they do what the people that surround them do.
Yes, well, not the people that surround them specifically, more what tells them what they have to do.
Who they were born to.
Yeah, because your social status tells you what to do. If you're a princess, you were born a princess and you have to do what princesses do. If you're an agricultural worker, you were born an agricultural worker and you do what agricultural workers do. Right? Social status dictates responsibilities. Now, anything else? No? Because there is another conservative idea, which we have to bring up now, which is the idea of unity, which is different. Yeah?
To conserve the way of govern.
The what?
Like if it's a monarchy, they continue having a monarchy for.
Yeah, so maybe another one is tradition, continuity, right? Now, what I was saying is union and unity are different concepts because while union implies that there's a decision being made for moral reasons, a decision by communities to get together, unity is actually a conservative concept where countries are understood as a unit that cannot be separated because of tradition, right? So here is where we see the example of Austria-Hungary. Why was nationalism a problem for Austria-Hungary?
Because it was made out of very different ethnics that could think like, oh, we speak the same language and have the same history, so we should be together.
And we should do what?
What they wanted.
No, but stay part of Austria-Hungary? So a lot of you answered that question okay, but the whole problem here is we need to say what specific thing Austria-Hungary was scared of. What were they not okay with when it came to nationalism?
That they will lose power.
Because why? What were these
Because
ethnic
different
groups?
ethnic groups would separate from the.
Yeah, exactly. So in a conservative state, if you have a random part of your country being like, you know what, we're declaring our independence, is the conservative state just going to be like, okay, as long as you're doing it for moral reasons, sounds great? No, right? They're like, no, our country is a unit. You can't just take away part of it, right? And there's this whole idea that if a unit breaks away or is invaded by another country or whatever, the unit has a right to take it back because it's part of them, right? So these few ideas, we have discussed them before, but which side do we see more reflected in the Mexican Declaration of Independence?
Conservatism,
Why?
because for example, they were putting like you can see equality because they put, I think it was Agustín de Iturbide as like a god, like it wasn't equal like all the Mexican.
So it talks about
And
maintaining
also
the
because
regional social structure, right?
yes, it was going to say to stay the same, like the same structure. Just the only difference was that they wouldn't be under the power of Spain.
Yeah, basically. And also we see the concept of unity, because in the Declaration of Independence, do we see any suggestion that Mexican states may not decide to enter the Mexican Empire? Not at all, right? It's the Mexican Empire is this one thing that deserves to be independent. Now, very good, everyone, good review. Now, as I was saying before, we are now going to talk about the liberal side of this coin, proverbial coin. Because the thing is, sure, the Mexican Declaration of Independence is very conservative. It's a very conservative document. We talked about this. Its conservative values are not foreign to us. Most of them still exist to an extent, right? It's not like if we were suddenly reading about Tai Chi or Feng Shui, right? It's something that we see as very close to our lives. However, we also recognize that there are many liberal aspects to the way Mexico is right now, correct? Because things like how we know that in the Constitution we are guaranteed certain rights. We know that there is no nobility. We know that, what else can you think of? We know that we're allowed to choose our own profession as individuals, right? There is no social status telling us, I don't know, Francisco, you're from a caste that sells watermelons. You have to sell watermelons. If I was like, no, I want to be a teacher, I can be a teacher, right? So the issue is, where does this come up? Because, one second, where am I? So the issue is, when we talk about the War of Reform, we are not going to focus on Maximiliano versus Juarez, because the thing is, their conflict was more about who was in charge. And it's a later phase of the liberal versus conservative movement. The beginning of this movement is what we actually call La Revolución de Ayutla, which happened about 5 years earlier. Now, like I said, we're not going to go with specific events and individuals and stuff, but the main idea here is that after the independence of Mexico, of the Mexican Empire, a lot of people that were mostly influenced by the independence of the United States were like, you know, this whole empire thing and then this whole conservative republic thing under Antonio López de Santa Anna is not what we actually want, right? They were like, if we already fought an entire war to be independent, we might as well build something like los gringos are doing, right? It makes sense. It sounds sexy when you're told, you know, there's this option where you can actually do what's correct for everyone and everyone wins, right? So liberals are like, Santa Anna, this is not cool how you're giving up part of our territory and stuff. So we're going to make a revolution, La Revolución de Ayutla. Now, like I said, I don't need you to know specific events about this specifically, but I do need you to be able to read a document and figure out if it's liberal or conservative. So, can someone help me read this fragment from the Plan de Ayutla? Anyone? Bueller?
Mm,
Alexa, can you read?
Me. Well, who?
Alexa? Or who's talking, Vanessa?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Vanessa, go.
Considerando que la mayoría de los pueblos no ha quedado satisfecha con la carta fundamental que le dieran sus mandatorios.
No, the first one, Plan de Ayutla.
Ok. Considerando que la permanencia de don Antonio López de Santana en él con exclusión absoluta de cualquier otro sistema de gobierno, poder es un amago constante para las libertades públicas, puesto que, con el mayor escándalo, bajo su gobierno se han hollado las garantías individuales. Solo ha venido a oprimir y dejar a los pueblos recargándolos de contribuciones onerosas sin consideración a la pobreza general, empleándose su producto en gastos superfluos.
Little slower.
Y formar la fortuna, como en otra época, de unos cuantos favoritos. Debiendo conservar la integridad del territorio de la República, ha vendido una parte considerable de ella, sacrificando a nuestros hermanos de la frontera del norte. Las instituciones republicanas son las únicas que convienen al país, con exclusión absoluta de cualquier otro sistema de gobierno.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Vanessa. Now, is this document liberal or conservative?
Liberal.
liberal.
Why?
Because it talks about rights, libertades públicas, like freedom for people, like, and also, yeah, that's it.
That's the only liberal idea? Because that's a good one. It talks about libertades públicas, so it talks about freedom. It also, does it talk about an individual perspective? Does it talk about Mexicans, the people, etc.? Does it?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Where? So it mentions garantías individuales,
Yes.
right? So we know it's guaranteeing something to individuals. What else? Where else?
Well, it talks about nuestros hermanos en el norte.
Right? It says sacrificando a nuestros hermanos en la frontera norte, right? So the thing here is, from a conservative perspective, when you have a piece of territory that is clearly not occupied by your people, and a more powerful opponent comes and is like, you know, I want the territory, I'm going to take it, and you're a conservative leader, you can just be like, okay, fine. I mean, it's clearly not in my strategic advantage to try to defend this huge piece of territory with almost no people. I clearly don't have the resources to be your opponent, so fine, take it. But from a liberal perspective, is the leader allowed to do that?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not what people want.
Not about what people want, really. What is the one thing a leader in a liberal regime has to do? When they make decisions, what do they have to show for them?
They have to ask the people, and people didn't want the territory to be.
Not necessarily. This is not about consensus.
Well, it's their territory and it's where they live, so not like someone can get.
Now, what is the one thing they have to do in a government, in a legitimate government?
A justification, a moral.
They have to justify it morally, right? So if the president were like, you know, giving up this territory is the right thing to do for A, B, and C reasons, that would be liberal. But in a conservative regime, do they have to do that?
No.
Not really. And from a liberal perspective, they can tell is it a good argument to tell the president, you know, this thing you did is wrong. The correct way would have been to do this other thing. Is that the kind of discussion you have in a liberal regime? Yes? No?
Yes.
Kind of, sometimes, maybe. Yeah, right? Now, we talked about how it mentions individuals. It talks about justification, how there is no justification for what Santa Anna did. What else? It talks about communities, pueblos, right?
It talks about fatherland and nationalism.
So it brings up nationalism and the fatherland, right? It brings up this belonging to a territory, and how for liberals, if a leader just violates the idea of fatherland like this, where the leader is like, you know what, maybe that state that's even called New Mexico, maybe it's not part of Mexico, whatever, we don't care. And people are like, what? Right? Now there is one other part here. Does it talk about equality? Because it talks about how Santa Anna's regime allowed unos cuantos favoritos to make fortunes, right? But is this a good thing in this document?
No.
Not at all, right? So we can assume it believes that equality is what should be done, right? Now, are republics necessarily liberal as opposed to monarchies? Are monarchies necessarily conservative?
Monarchies are not necessarily conservative.
Nope. And are republics necessarily liberal?
No.
Not really, right? Now, the thing is, here they are advocating to maintain a republic, but they want a specific type of republic, right? They want a republic that recognizes equality, that recognizes the individual perspective, and that recognizes freedom and liberty, right? So
I have a question.
Yes?
How can a monarchy not be conservative?
Well, some monarchies have constitutions, they have congresses, they engage in this discussion about what is the right thing to do.
But at the same time, there is not. I think in monarchy there is no equality, so it can be liberal.
No, but there can be. Think of the United Kingdom right now. It's a monarchy, but it's liberal.
Okay.
Right? Monarchy just means you have a king or a queen. It doesn't say anything about how they behave towards society. Yeah?
Yes, I understand.
Same thing with republics, because think of Syria. It's a republic, but it's hereditary, it's very violent, there is no representation, etc. Yeah? Okay, so conclusion, is the Plan de Ayutla liberal or conservative?
Liberal.
Very liberal. Now, the issue with liberalism, especially in Mexico in the 1850s, is that liberalism assumes a few things about people that maybe we are incorrect to assume, right? They assume that people are trustworthy and that people will try to do the right thing. But are all people trustworthy and trying to do the right thing? Not really, right? Some people are ambitious. Some people are not very smart. Some people are smart and want to, but not for the right purposes, right? So the thing is, the Constitution of 1857, which we will not get into very deeply because it's kind of boring, honestly. But the problem with the Constitution of 1857 is that it was so liberal that it assumed that certain things would just work themselves out because people were trying to do the right thing, right? Especially when it talks about the way the president dealt with Congress. It was mostly assuming that they were working together and there was no reason for them to block each other's work. However, 19th century Mexico, was everyone doing the right thing and trying to keep things going? Not at all. So in the Revolución de Ayutla, the liberals win and they win the presidency. They have a new constitution. They do things like they would interpret the United States to do them, really. It's very much an American influence in the Mexican government at this point. But it's not really working because the system assumes that everyone is trying to do their best. And a lot of these people are not doing their best. They're mostly trying to block each other from achieving things. So an opposition group is not happy and they come up with the Plan de Tacubaya, the first Plan de Tacubaya, because there's another one from the Mexican Revolution. So here we're going to focus on the first one. Can someone read it, please? Fernanda, can you read it?
Yes. Considerando que la mayoría de los pueblos no ha quedado satisfecha con la carta fundamental que le dieran sus mandatarios, porque ella no ha sabido hermanar el progreso con el orden y la libertad, y porque la oscuridad, con muchas de sus disposiciones, ha sido el germen de la guerra civil. Considerando que la República necesita de instituciones análogas a sus usos y costumbres, y el desarrollo de sus elementos de riqueza y prosperidad, fuente verdadera de la paz pública y del engrandecimiento y respetabilidad de que es tan digna en el interior y en el extranjero, considerando que la Fuerza Armada no debe sostener lo que la nación no quiere, y sí ser el apoyo y la defensa de la voluntad pública, bien expresada ya de todas maneras.
Thank you. Now, is this document conservative or liberal? Let's make a review. Does it mention individuals or an individual perspective? Does it say Mexicans are free to do whatever they want? What does it say before? Los hermanos de la frontera, whatever? Because it does talk about Mexicans, but it talks about them in a very specific way, right?
So yes, no?
Yes, what?
Like, yeah, they are talking about, like, you say equality or freedom?
I said equality.
Equality.
Or more, not equality, more like the individual perspective. Do they talk about individuals at any point? Or do they talk about pueblos and la nación and...
It's conservative.
Who said it's conservative?
Me.
Who? Say your name. State your name and purpose.
Anna.
Oh, Anna. Anna, tell us, why is it conservative? It was Anna or the Anna? State your name and purpose.
It was me, Shanat.
Ah. Okay, Shanat, why is it conservative? Tell us.
Because as you said, it talks about all the nation, all the pueblo, and it doesn't talk about each person in concrete.
So it talks about the
That's
units of los pueblos, la nación. It doesn't say Mexicans, it doesn't say citizens, it doesn't say individuals, right? It's this unit that is supposed to do things a certain way. Now, does it talk about justifying things morally in terms of institutions? Does it say the Republic needs institutions that are correct, that do the right thing?
Yes.
There.
Que la República necesita de instituciones análogas a sus...
Instituciones análogas a sus usos y costumbres means it needs institutions that match its customs. It doesn't say it needs institutions that do the right thing.
It says that the army should defend the public will.
Defend public peace, right? Public will. Now, when it talks about changing the government, because this is a document that says the government should change, but does it talk about having a new government that does things the right way, or does it talk about a government that maintains things the way they are, that maintains order, that maintains continuity? Anyone? I even underlined parts.
Continuity?
Yeah, right? It talks about how the government is wrong, but it's not wrong because it's doing the wrong things. It's wrong because it's not maintaining order, right? Yeah?
Yes.
Anyone? So if this were a liberal document, would it just talk about maintaining order? Or would it say something along the lines of, so the government is wrong because it did this, this, and this wrong, and we suggest doing these other things because they would be right? Or is it more about, there's a lot of disorder, We need people to know exactly what they have to do, and we need there to be order, right? The part about instituciones análogas a usos y costumbres, think of it this way. If you have a pueblo in the middle of Oaxaca, where there is one priest in charge of everyone, and everyone has to do what the priest says, from a liberal perspective, do you just allow that to continue? Or do you go there and are like, a ver, no, we have to have elections, I need to see a presidente municipal, you have to have documents, you need laws, you need to give people rights, they need to get paid, they need to be happy? Or do you just go like, bueno, instituciones análogas a usos y costumbres, that's their custom, please keep on doing that?
If it's liberal, it needs to ask them to have like the moral justification.
Right? Yeah, correct. They need, and from a liberal perspective, you would ask them, and what exactly is the justification for all of this, right? And if they can't come up with anything, if they can't justify it, what do you do as a liberal?
You start a revolution.
Well, you make them change it, right? You're like, you know what? This is not going to work out. Now, we're not going to go forward too much. Right now, we're still in the 1850s. But nowadays in Mexico, how do we deal with pueblos that do that kind of thing? Do they get a liberal response where the government is like, I don't care. You need to justify this or do things the right way? Or do we have certain places where it's like, well, usos y costumbres, that's how it works there?
Yeah, the second one.
Well, both, really, right?
Yeah, in some places.
Both exist. And does this make sense mentally, logically?
No.
Not really.
Not really, right? Because the issue here is, we already talked about how the independence of Mexico was a distinctly conservative movement. We also have talked about, briefly, about how the War of Reform is a distinctly liberal movement, right? That resulted in a super liberal constitution, super liberal president that we still remember. We still have in our 20 peso bill, right? Very liberal. But nowadays, are we super liberal or super conservative? Because think of it this way. We have pueblos with usos y costumbres, but we also have places where you need a justification for things, right? For example, could we say that in Mexico, equality is enforced? When someone is not treated equally, are people like, wait a second, that's bad, right? Are there scandals? For example, when there's a few every year, where, for example, indigenous people are turned away from hospitals or from restaurants because they're indigenous, and people are people like, well, yeah, they're inferior, or are people like, oh, that's so awful?
That's awful.
Right, well, right. So we are kind of liberal in that sense. Similarly, think of parts of Mexico where organized crime has caused a lot of violence, right? And people complain about it. But when they complain about it, do they complain about it in a liberal sense where they're like, you know, government, we need to discuss what the right thing to do is, right? If you are President Calderon and you send the army to Michoacán and Sinaloa, okay, fine, that's a proposal, but let's discuss these other proposals about what the right thing to do is. Or is there complaint more along the lines of, hey, government, you need to maintain order. We want order and peace. More the second one, especially in that example, right? Because even President Calderon, who was very liberal, was very much actually said things publicly like, I don't care what you think, right? The right thing to do was to fight organized crime. And people opposing him were very much like, we don't care what the right thing to do is. We don't want your disorder here, right? Another example would be, think of using the Auditorio Nacional for school graduations, right? Big universities have sometimes considered doing that, having their graduation ceremony in Auditorio Nacional. Tec de Monterrey has considered it. People from UNAM or Ibero consider it. But think of it this way. Would we react the same way to that type of graduation in Auditorio Nacional than to a CONALEP graduation in Auditorio Nacional? Why not? If we're all equal, right? Because that's the issue, that even now, especially now during an election year, we have to kind of become conscious of these types of, I wouldn't call them hypocrisy, because hypocrisy involves actively maintaining these dynamics that don't really match, but really these incoherences, right? Where for some things we are very much liberal. We're like, it is not correct that you discriminate against indigenous people if they want to go into city market. But at the same time, we're like, el CONALEP en el Auditorio Nacional, por favor. Right? Doesn't really make sense in our heads. And when we are trying to participate in politics by voting or by being informed, we need to be very conscious of these things. Yeah? Any questions? Not right now? Okie dokie. So on Wednesday, we will talk a little more about this, but focusing a little more on the international perspective here. Because the thing is, while Mexico was having fights between liberals and conservatives, a lot of countries, mainly the United States and France, were like, we need to kind of intervene here, right? That is very relevant. Now, I believe that's it for now. Any questions? Nothing? Janat, everything good? Super comfortable? Good job. Okie dokie. Well, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, see you either tomorrow in Colegio Alemán or on Wednesday. Okay, bye.